And let's see, I'm going to introduce Sam now. So Sam Collins is a maritime historian and tall ship sailor who has spent the last 20 years working on boats and islands up and down the coast of New England. After receiving an undergraduate degree in maritime history and an MA in museum studies with a focus on Atlantic history, he ran the museum on Star Island for 6 years and wrote his final project on the rise and fall of the salt cod fishing community that made up the former town of Gosport. He lives in Maine on a small farm, not too far from saltwater. So with that, Sam, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, folks. So yeah, thank you for that introduction. And I'm going to start off with going over a bit of the history of the Isles of Shoals with the resources that you can dig into to explore specific facets as we go along. But I always talk to a lot of people in the Portsmouth area who have never been to the Isles of Shoals or who don't know about it or who only are familiar with that sort of faint white smear on the horizon when you're standing at Odeon Point. And for me, that's what the Isles of Shoals were when I first moved to the area, because my background has really dovetails nicely into the Isles of Shoals. They are responsible for a lot of my academic career because my very first job back in college was housekeeping out at the hotel out there. Nowadays, there is a nonprofit that runs religious and educational conferences all summer long out there. And my first year, I was on housekeeping, going through all of these old buildings. And being bored out of my skull at the time, I was trying to wonder who was here in the first place on these rocks 10 miles out from anywhere, what brought them here, and more importantly, where did they go? Why weren't they still in these houses? And that really sparked my curiosity and has shaped my academic career into examining the history of the North Atlantic fisheries and how the communities that have made their living by it have had to be equally shaped as the fish stocks they were chasing rose and fell. And as was said, I ran the museum out there for about 5 or 6 years, and I spent most of a decade out there in other positions as well. And I assume if you're here, you have an idea of where they are, but just in case, yeah, this is my background slide here. Part of while I was out there, watching the ships coming and going from the harbor of Gosport really helped inspire the feeling of the fishing community that was out there, and then led me into my next part of my career working on tall ships, such as the schooner American Eagle pictured here. By my beautiful MS Paint illustration here, you can see the Isles of Shoals are a cluster about 10 miles off the coast of New England. It's about an hour by boat if you're taking the Isles of Shoals Steamship Company. And it's the Isles of Shoals make up between 9 and 15 islands, depending on the time, the tide, the weather, and what you consider an island. You can see there's some major ones, but there's also a bunch of smaller ledges here that are technically islands, but a lot of them are mostly awash. The islands we're going to be talking about are Appledore right here, Smuttynose, and Star Island, though we will be touching on some of the others like Lunging and White and Cedar. But for the most part, when you think occupation of the Isles of Shoals, you're talking these 3 main islands, Appledore, Smutty, and Star. And the breakwaters that make up Gosport Harbor were put in the late 1800s to improve the harbor, though the very first breakwater was put in right between Smuttynose and Malaga right there to help protect that little cove back around 1800. And this is the only good harbor for miles in all directions. So if you're sailing from, say, Portland down to Boston and bad weather comes up, this is one of the few places you can duck in, which made it an extremely important hub for transit, pretty much from the first person to put a canoe in the water out there. That is one of the only safe harbors of refuge. And the first peoples out at the shoals were native peoples. The Wabanaki inhabited part of this area, but they're mostly a bit further north. A lot of the groups that were in our area are groups called the Almushikwa and other seasonal occupations. And you can see these names in blue on the chart here, which comes from the Falmouth Historical Society, are names of some of the local Almushikwa bands, which, if you're familiar with New England geography, line up a lot with some of our current place names, or at least you'll recognize in a lot of New England names, such as Agamenticus, the Agawam, the Noskeed Mills. There's a whole bunch of these names that have lingered even after the people that were specifically there were pushed back through European expansion. As far as native peoples and the Isles of Shoals, which is omitted on this map, which is an unfortunate oversight from a lot of map makers, the shoals are right about under the A in Atlantic here. And that's a little too far out for year-round native occupation in the early period. That a lot of the native fisheries tended to be more inshore. They would come out and perhaps camp for a while in the summer, do some local harvesting on a seasonal basis, but then move back to the mainland for the winter. As far as we know, archaeology does not suggest large-scale year-round occupation by native peoples out there, which is what made it attractive when the first Europeans started coming on the scene. And Star Island it also has a land acknowledgement as well, like as was read at the beginning here, that Star Island and the Isles of Shoals themselves are within the waters of Indakina, the traditional lands and waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and other related Wabanaki peoples past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This image on the left is an 18th century illustration of some of the Abenaki people who would have been in the approximate area at the time. But as I said, when the first Europeans showed up here, they did not encounter anybody else currently living at the shoals, partly because that seasonal occupation, and also because of the pattern of disease and genocide that had already reduced population pressure in the area from native peoples. The reason people were coming over here, at least from Europe, to get rich on codfish. The early fisheries were conducted, this is a slightly later illustration, but the early fisheries were conducted in a pretty similar manner to what we see here. There's a group of guys fishing over the rail with hand lines. They can then unload their cargo onto the wharves. It is splitted and salted and left to dry on shore. And the reason they were going for cod is because it is a highly nutritionally dense, shelf-stable protein when it's salted. You can pull a codfish out, salt it and dry it, and then ship it around the world without worrying about it spoiling. Unlike oilier fishes like mackerel or tuna that really needed canning to become commercially viable. But the Isles of Shoals salt cod really set the market price at the time. It was one of the highest qualities of salt codfish in the world, and their product really was the standard by which many other grades of codfish were judged. And this high profit attracted a lot of fishermen and investors. The historian Peter Pope talks about the seasonal shift of labor as like the strokes of a pump, that in the summertime, you get a bunch of people coming over here to New England to work and fish. As the summer winds down and winter starts to come on, that pump reverses itself and people go back to Europe for the winter, but the pump leaks. And every season, more and more people decide to stay instead of packing up to go back to Europe. A lot of those early fishing stations drew people in, mostly young men who, without a lot of connections, looking for a way to make some money, who were also willing to then take an axe and start going inland and see if they could make a home for themselves if there wasn't enough attraction for them back in England. And we know that the Isles of Shoals was settled by European fishermen, mostly from England, as early as about 1605, 1610. They're really early. In fact, Miles Standish was sent up here to buy codfish for the starving pilgrims in 1623. The Shoals station was already well established at that point. And again, this was a safe offshore base, and it was close to the fishing bank. So it was a really good setup for them. And again, you can see here, probably picture this scene without those trees, and you can picture mostly what this would have looked like for the Isles of Shoals fishery, because they never had much trees out there, but they had plenty of dry space to put their codfish out to dry on shore. Who are those early shoalers? Because a lot of them are single young men without connections, a lot of them are very hard to track. If you've got genealogical dead ends in New England in like the really early 1600s, chances are you know what I'm talking about, that a lot of these single young men, they don't have marriage records to show up. They aren't paying taxes because they're not property owners. Oftentimes the only way we do see them, which is fairly reliable for that demographic, is in the court records, when these single young men get into fist fights or decide to take a grudge against a neighbor and get wound into court for it. And some of the common early surnames here, you may recognize a few from later seacoast area prominent families, but a lot of the early shoals fishermen came and went so rapidly that they didn't necessarily start the dynasties that have led to some of the big names on the lovely old houses in downtown Portsmouth. But a few here you will recognize, like Pepperell. Sir William Pepperell did live out on Appledore before he moved, or his family lived on Appledore before moving over to Kittery and creating the Pepperell home over there. Cuts and Cutting. Again, some of these names did move on and become prominent around here, but for the most part, they're highly transient. But you can find them in the York County court records, and to a lesser extent, the Essex County court records as well. New Hampshire's court records are very blurry at this time period just because the geography was so vague. And again, we're talking like 1600 to 1660, 1680 in that range. The first town out of the shoals was the town of Appledore, which existed only for 20 years over on Appledore Island, and no records have really survived from that, unfortunately. The Isles of Shoals, partly because the Shoalers did not leave much in the way of written records of their own, has meant that a lot of times their story's been told by others, specifically the fine folks down in the Plymouth colony at the time, who were writing with a very distinct agenda to contrast themselves as a godly city on the hill up against these drunken ruffians to the north. So the Shoalers really get a bad rap of being described in the records as these sort of foul-mouthed drunken illiterates who want nothing more than to sort of lay around and enjoy their liquor. But you keep in mind, again, that's being written from the perspective of the Puritans who want to make themselves look a bit better. And the Shoals reputation isn't really supported by the crime rate at the time. Only one resident of the Shoals per year ended up getting hauled to court between 1640 and 1680. You also see local missionaries writing exaggerations in order to continue to get donations for their work. Of course, they're going to write how bad things are out there. This is why you should fund them for another year. So those missionaries who start showing up in a little bit later have a vested interest in making the Shoalers look worse than they were. In truth, most fishermen were no different from other colonists. They were coming over trying to make a living for themselves. And unfortunately, the way the fishing system worked was these fishermen were independent contractors who were having their fish purchased by fish merchants who really held an uneven balance of power. The fish merchants would often require the fishermen to be purchasing all their supplies from them. So by the end of the year, a fisherman may not have ended up even with a profit if he had to buy too many things during the summer. The cost of his catch would not outweigh his tally at the company store. So the Shoaler fishermen often found reason to get into trouble over that sort of arrangement. But many did go on to form families and communities. And by the late 1690s, the most prosperous folks out at the Shoals were actually absentee landowners living down in Essex County, living down in the Newburyport area. And they had a lot of legal wranglings with the fishermen over property rights and such. And again, that's another good area to try and find out who is who for tracing your genealogy, is to find those late 1600s court cases where you see these fishing masters who start suing large numbers of the population out there because somebody is or is not doing what they are told to. You also start seeing probate inventories coming in as the material wealth starts to build up enough to be worth putting an inventory to go through probate. If you were a broke young man without a lot to your name, your possessions could get divided up pretty easily among your friends. But once you start talking established, prosperous fishing masters, the probate inventories are available. And some of those, the probate records can be found through county court records. There's also the New Hampshire state and provincial papers, which include a lot of fairly dry legislative stuff, but it does touch on the Shoals with lists of names of people who are petitioning for various things. So again, it gives you a little bit of a snapshot of a census of who was out there. This is Smuttynose. Smuttynose Island is that long, skinny one on the map, and that was the first real center of industry out of the shoals. There was it was the major hub of early settlement. They had a rope walk, they had a grist mill, there was a tavern, and this tavern was the center of an archaeology project done out at the shoals within the last couple decades by Dr. Nathan Hamilton, starting in 2008, that they excavated on Smuttynose, specifically focusing on the tavern and fishing station site dating between 1630s and 1710. And that archaeology has really helped flesh out some of the details of early settlement, because when you're just looking at dried lists of names, digging through, as I rather flippantly call it, digging through dead people's trash is a great way to figure out what their daily life was like. What you can get an idea of their diet, of their vices. See all these tobacco pipes on the bottom here, these clay pipes. Tons and tons of them are found all over all the Isles of Shoals. There's 300 years of history and 3 feet of topsoil. So this stuff is right there beneath our feet, and it helps paint a picture of what life was like. There's also some of these liquor bottles out here as well. That's a reproduction, but that one is an excavated one. And the major focus of the dig was on ecology. They were looking at specifically the history of, they were looking at the size and health of the codfish stocks on a historical scale. But as a side note, for those of us who are more into the anthropology side of things, it provided a lot more human interest stuff as well. The community on Smuttynose really started to collapse and moved over to Star in the 1700s, where they founded the town of Gosport. This Star has grown back a bit since then, but it still is pretty bare. There's not a lot of topsoil out there. Nowadays, this back half of the island has a lot of sumac and rosebush and such. But right here, the Chapel Rock and stuff still looks pretty similar to how it has for hundreds of years. Not much in the way of dirt. But the town of Gosport was founded on Star Island on Christmas Eve in 1715, and the town records start in 1731. And the population for the islands really is entirely based on the earlier part of its history, that their population peaks in the 1700s and really crashes with the American Revolution, the uncertainties of life out there, because again, they were that position of being so exposed, which had been good for the fisheries, was really bad during a time period of naval warfare. That made them very vulnerable to being raided by British ships. And it also, their loyalties were not trusted. The Committee of Safety here in Portsmouth writes several times about how they don't know if the Shoalers are actually secretly dealing with the British or not. And they go back and forth about whether the Shoalers should be forcibly evacuated. But when the town was set up, their first minister of record really is a guy named John Tuck, who was a Harvard graduate who took up the post at the Shoals in 1732 and died out there in 1773. And he's the one who starts keeping the Gosport church records and the Gosport town records. And those have all been transcribed. They're available. There's probably a copy here at this library, but they're also available through Google Books because it's 19th century public domain these days. It was reprinted. And John Tuck starts writing the records in this very crabbed hand, which is a bit of a challenge to read. So thank God that 19th century doctor took it on himself to transcribe all of the records. And these church records are handy because they also help reveal people who might otherwise be invisible from the written records. Women who have children out of wedlock. This is one of the rare cases where their names get mentioned. That a lot of times, if you were a woman in a lot of the early modern world, women tended to get identified by their male relatives, whereas in the church records, they get recognized by their own names. And that's a really sort of precious glimpse that is not visible in many other places. You also see women getting mentioned by name in the church records when they are being released to other churches following a marriage or the death of a spouse. If they're leaving the Shoals and want to join the church here in Portsmouth or join a church down at Hampton, their names are included in the record. So again, that helps give you an idea of putting some names to your female ancestors as well. And the Gosport town records also provide the only records of Black people out of the Shoals. We have There's a reference to a gentleman named Black Charles living on the island in the 1730s, who may have been a free man as he was paid by the town to ring the church bell and clean the meeting house, that he was a paid employee of the town. Reverend John Tuck and another prosperous fisherman named Samuel Abbott are the only two people at the Shoals known to have kept enslaved people. And the church records, again, provide the only glimpses of those people existed, because there are two children named Dolly and Peter, who are specifically referenced as, in the vernacular, referenced as Negro children. And they're baptized in the 1740s, but their mother is not given. And Dolly is also noted as being of mixed parentage. So there's some questions there as well, especially with the power imbalance of being an enslaved person in the household. And there's another person named Candace, who again is a child of color belonging to Mr. John Tuck, who was baptized in 1742, and 20 years later, her own daughter gets baptized in the church as well. So, you know, there were some communities, there were some people of color out at the Shoals who were living their lives. And it's tempting to wonder if any of those folks are among those buried in the African burying ground here on Chestnut Street in Portsmouth. There's no graves for them at the Isles of Shoals, which is not surprising. A lot of the early folks out there don't have surviving gravestones either, but it is tempting to wonder. With the coming of the American Revolution, the Shoals population really craters. That the records get sparse again. People stop writing things down for a while. The distrust of the Shoalers' loyalty led to the population being put under a bunch of restrictions. They were never forcibly evacuated. There's legislation is pretty vague on that. But it appears they were not forcibly evacuated, but they were denied the right to free travel. The Shoalers were essentially confined to the Isles of Shoals and told they could only come ashore at 2 specific harbors on the mainland to trade for supplies. And it does not suggest that those merchants who were supplying them had to obey any sort of price restraints or anything. So the Shoals were a captive market to the predatory merchants. And faced with that and the very real specter of having their houses burned out from under them by raiding parties, a lot of Shoalers moved ashore and did not come back after the Revolution. The village of Gosport never really recovered after the War of 1812. It's not until like the 1860s you see the population starting to climb again, and then it all comes crashing down in the 1870s. Because the population pool is a bit smaller at the Shoals in the 1800s, you're limited to like 6 or 7 surnames. The major names at the Shoals: Caswell, Newton, Randall, Berry, Downs, and Robinson. But they also go to Rye a lot to find spouses. So they're heavily intermarried into Rye families like the Genesis, Fosses, Verrill, Mace, Bragg, Crockett, Currier. A lot of the sort of old families of Rye are heavily intermarried into the people who are living out on the Shoals in the 19th century. And part of that is that the Shoalers were mostly coming and going from Rye Harbor as an easy, straight shot without having to worry about fighting the current of the Piscataqua in those days before power boats. Rye was a good harbor for them to get into and out of. This is a view of Star Island here, taken pretty much from the chapel, looking towards Cedar and Smuttynose, looking north, with a few of with some of those houses and a few children there killing some time on the rocks. When the population of the Shoals came back after the uncertainties of the American Revolution and the War of 1812, they began to try to put their community together in the face of a world that had changed while they weren't looking. The fisheries undergo major changes in the early 19th century. Salt cod starts falling in popularity as fresh fish becomes more widely available. You've got advances in technology like refrigeration and railroads that now mean you can get your fresh fish inland further, faster. And so trendy housewives were serving fresh fish, and salt cod becomes stigmatized as a food for poor people and immigrants. And so the price falls. Combined with centuries of overfishing starting to catch up with it, the codfish they are catching are smaller, they're not as high quality, so they're working harder for a product that is not getting as much money back. So the fortunes really start to fall around here as far as the fishermen go. And A few shoalers did try to switch industries. The real cash cow at the time is mackerel and menhaden in the mid 1800s, but those are a totally different kind of fishing. What the picture here shows a style of fishing for codfish, which isn't terribly changed from that first picture I showed you of guys fishing over the rails on that larger ship. That to catch a codfish, you can go out there, drop a baited hook down, maybe he'll take it, maybe he won't. Mackerel, though, are fast fish and they feed on the fly, they feed into the wind. It's a net fishery, so you need to have fast boats that can keep up with the schools of mackerel and be able to get your nets out in time to catch the schools. And if you miss it, you don't catch anything that day. So it's a boom bust cycle. It also takes a lot more capital to be able to switch into the more expensive gear, but with no guarantee of return. But your codfish still isn't paying the bills. So it puts the communities in a really tough spot. The shoalers are then having to compete with major mainland ports because the economic shakeups of the Civil War drove a lot of small operators out of business and consolidated effort into the big fishing conglomerates in like Portland and Gloucester and Boston. So a lot of the small outports at the Shoals and up the coast of Maine really found themselves kind of out of luck at that point. One way to make money that was starting to look more promising was hotels. The first hotel at the Isles of Shoals is down here on the left here. That is the Mid-Ocean House that was out on Smuttynose. And a gentleman by the name of Thomas Layton started running that for a while. And he had been the lighthouse keeper over on White Island. And he eventually moved out to Appledore with his family and built this large complex you see back there called the Appledore Hotel. In fact, the Laytons are the ones responsible for giving the island of Appledore its name. Prior to that, it was called Hog Island. And I can only imagine that Mr. Layton looked at his advertising and realized calling his new place the Hog House was going to be a much harder sell than the Appledore House. But he brought his wife and his 3 children, 2 sons, Oscar and Cedric, and a daughter who would become the poet Celia Thaxter, which is, if people know any celebrity of the Isles of Shoals, that's usually the name they recognize. And the Isles of Shoals Steamship Company's vessel, Thomas Layton, is named after Celia's dad. And we'll get into more of them in a second. But while we're on the subject of hotels, when that big Appledore Hotel opens up, people start coming to it and it starts taking off. And in the early 1870s, a guy named John Poor, who was the heir to the Stickney and Poor Mustard Company fortune, decides that he wants to get a slice of this pie for himself. He looks across the harbor at the dying little town of Gosport and convinces almost all of the residents to sell their homes to him. And then he tears many of them down and builds this large oceanic hotel on the front lawn of today's Star Island landscape. If you've been to Star before, the tennis courts out there are part of the old foundation of that. The pier is in the right spot for today's usage, but that big hotel is no longer there. It burned to the ground after only 3 years of operation, which is a shame because it was extremely cutting edge for its time. It had plumbing with salt water running in the fixtures. They had bowling alleys, and they had the first elevator installed in the country out there on Star. So when the Oceanic Hotel burns, John Poor rebuilds using some of the fishermen's homes he had not torn down and consolidates them. The Caswell brothers were some of the major landowners on Star before the hotels bought it out. And Origin had been running the Gosport house here. His brother Lemuel had been running the Atlantic house here. That's another fisherman's house that's been put together. And Poor used all the lumber he had available to build a large wing going back from the face we see here. He didn't even miss a season. They rebuilt over the course of one winter and opened for the next summer as if nothing had happened. Quite the motivated construction crews. Back over on Appledore, the reason Appledore did so well is largely through Celia Thaxter, who really made a name for herself through her love of poetry and nature and and the sort of the attitude of cultivation, the atmosphere of cultivation that she attracted, that she made the Appledore Hotel a popular gathering spot for wealthy elites, turning regular concerts and poetry readings in her salon, which attracted a lot of 19th century celebrities, people like Hawthorne, Sarah Orne Jewett, John Greenleaf Whittier, Child Hassam, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And of course, as with any sort of trendy spot, all the ordinary people who wanted to go get a chance to bump shoulders with those celebrities. So the Appledore Hotel did a booming business for quite a while. And actually that picture that we're looking at this is the site of her garden. That archway would have led up to her home, which is no longer there. But Celia's garden was really a breath of fresh air on the gardening scene at the time. Celia's main goal was using the little bit of topsoil she had to provide flowers for the tables of the hotel and for her own home. She loved the flowers. And so instead of doing the very fixed sort of formal English gardening style, she really packed flowers in a very exuberant way, making the best use of the space she could, and really helped start a distinctly American style of gardening. And she wrote a book. She wrote a book about gardening that really inspired a lot of people to move away from the sort of formal garden layouts and embrace the chaos of putting as many flowers in a small space as you could, which also inspired the people around her. This is a painting by Child Hassam called "The Room of Flowers," and this is an illustration of Celia's salon. And this picture was actually painted right around the time that Celia herself died. So this picture is both sort of capturing the salon, what it looked like, but also puts an extra meaning to all of the vases of flowers you see in this room. There's every single surface has flowers on it. And so if you take that in mind, that her love of her own flowers combined with her friends' awareness of her love of the flowers. And Celia herself is a really useful resource for piecing together daily life and people who were out at the Shoals. Much of her correspondence survives. There's a book called Letters to Celia and another book called Letters from Celia. And Letters to Celia is mostly written by her brothers, Cedric and Oscar, while she was away on the mainland. She spent a lot of time ashore with living in communities on the mainland, but always her heart was out of the Shoals. So her brothers tried to keep her informed of what she was missing. And those letters provide a really useful glimpse of year-round life and one of the few glimpses of 19th century working class life at the harbor, because at the Shoals, because even though Cedric and Oscar were the proprietors of this hotel, they were also the guys who were out there mending the fences with a couple of hired guys from Gosport. They were working cheek by jowl with the Norwegian immigrants who lived on Smuttynose, that they very much were not confined to just the hotel's domestic sphere. So it provides a really interesting glimpse of some people who left very little written records of their own. Celia passes away in 1894, and that is part of the decline in fortunes of the Appledore Hotel, because once Celia stops hosting her salons and bringing these famous celebrities out, sort of that tap switches off. The taps of tourism start to close, and the Leighton brothers find themselves in financial difficulties. They had purchased Star Island after John Poor decided he was done with his business in the 1870s. So by the 1890s, the Leighton family owns Appledore, Smuttynose, and Star Island, and they're having a hard time making their mortgage payments. And that's around the time when a gentleman approaches them to discuss the possibility of having their Unitarian summer meetings out there. They had been having them at another location in the White Mountains, but decided to give the Shoals a try instead. And it was a rousing success. The Leightons were a bit skeptical at first, but that first conference in 1897 drew over 600 people out to the Isles. Local papers reported that staff had given up their beds and Unitarians were sleeping in bathtubs at the Isles of Shoals. They really succeeded beyond their possible expectations. Despite that, though, that was still only a couple weeks of the year. That didn't provide the stable income that they needed. And so the Leightons eventually we're facing some tough choices when the Appledore Hotel burned to the ground in 1914 after closing for the season. This picture here, we would be looking at the main body of the hotel here is completely invisible in the smoke. Celia's garden is over on this side of the picture, but the fire just destroyed pretty much everything standing out there. However, several of the hotel registers do still survive, and those are at the Portsmouth Athenaeum. If you haven't been out there to the Athenaeum, I highly recommend it. They do have open, I believe they're open by appointment. I think they also have an open research hours depending on their schedule. But they have a lot of the material for Star Island Corporation on deposit there, including the registers and hotel books that survive from the Appledore, so you can see just the names of the people who were out there and where they were coming from and how long they were staying. That always surprises me, that you see people who would book a room for 3 months at a time, if they were going for the season. And Star Island also has one piece of artwork that survived from the burning, from Celia Thaxter's burning cottage. There is one piece of artwork that's rather water stained along the edges. That was because when Oscar Layton, Celia's brother, was on Star when the fire broke out, and even though he was in his 80s or 90s or in his 70s at the time, he got in a rowboat and came over as fast as he could and started throwing things out the windows to save them, and before the flames beat him back. Appledore today is owned by the Star Island Corporation, which is the same nonprofit that owns Star Island, but most of it is being used for Shoals Marine Lab, which has been a joint project of Cornell and UNH. And there's not much in the way of historical archives out there on Appledore itself. A lot of their material, as I said, has been brought into the Athenaeum, so that's a really handy way to see it without having to arrange a boat ride. But unlike Star, the foundations and the ruins of the old buildings were never cleared away. They're still there underneath the brush. During my time running the museum on Star, we would do weekly walking tours of Appledore, and it always fascinated me to notice underneath all this greenery, you can see the big granite slabs and the old iron pipes and the melted window glass along the ground from where the hotels burned. It just fascinates me to see that history so close to the surface up there. It was never re-landscaped. They pretty much just walked away after it burned and let the land reclaim it. A few of these buildings did survive the fire. These two cottages here, I think that one as well. This picture is taken from inside Celia's garden, so her home would have been behind us here. And nowadays they do a lot of marine biology field research. It's one of the largest undergraduate marine biology field schools in the country. And one of the most prominent things you can see from shore is this tower here, which was put up during the Second World War to help coordinate the artillery defenses. It's not a sub-spotting tower. That's the rumor that goes around if you ever listen to one of the tour boats. It was used to help coordinate the fire from the artillery batteries at Odiorn Point and Little Harbor. And it is accessible through occasional day trips with a group of garden volunteers. Sometimes Shoals Marine Lab does open house days as well and will coordinate day trips out there. And the other way is if you go out and spend time on Star Island. As I said, a weekly trip is usually part of the offerings that the history programs provide. So if you want to get a chance to walk around Appledore, there are a few ways to get out there. It just requires a little bit of looking around. And another one that's accessible by very narrow windows is White Island, which this photo is taken from Star, the White Island Lighthouse. The current tower was built in 1859, and it's off limits most of the time. You can like once or twice a year they open it up for visitors, but you really got to keep your ear to the ground for that. That said, there's a number of boats in the area that will do trips around there so you can look at it. I don't know if Sue Reynolds is still running the Uncle Oscar out of Rye, but she did a lot of very knowledgeable presentations on that Sue Reynolds worked with a bunch of middle schoolers in Rye to save their pennies to restore that lighthouse. And Cedar Island is another island that is 99% off limits. But it is worth mentioning. This is the island that is in between Smuttynose and Star. It forms sort of the corner of the Gosport Harbor pocket. And these are the only two buildings out there. This long gray one used to stand on the pier at Smuttynose. It was a fish storage shed on the wharf. Now it's a nice little cabin. And that Cedar Island is still owned by descendants of the Gosport fishermen. The families who live there can trace their family back 400 years. Like they're the only shoaler families who have never left. They still own their land out there. I think they all live ashore most of the time these years. But when I first started working for Star in the early 2000s, both of those cabins were occupied by local lobstermen from the families most of the summers, which is still pretty nifty. And again, it's not really open to the public unless you manage to go sweet talk one of them when you find them out there. And Smuttynose and Malaga Island today. Malaga is the little tiny island sort of off to the left here on the other side of this, which Malaga appears in the records pretty much once when people write down when the houses out there get washed away by bad weather. Malaga is essentially a speed bump for the North Atlantic. There is not much as far as settlement out there. However, Smuttynose, Smuttynose is famous these days for two things: the murders and the beer. Which is rather unfortunate for an island with such an interesting past, as we've kind of touched on here. Smuttynose and Malaga today are still owned by descendants of the Leighton and Thaxter families, but they do provide it open to the public during the summer for respectful visitors. Like you can come and walk around. There's a small graveyard back in the underbrush that way. And they've all been indexed on Find a Grave too, which is very handy if you're doing gravestone research. And there's Smuttynose stewards out there during the summer who are present to answer questions and keep an eye on things. And they get to live in the Haley House here, which is a beautifully rustic and unupdated structure inside. It looks very much like you could be back in the 19th century inside that cabin. And it is accessible by private boat. You can also take a rowboat over from Star. So again, if you go out to Star Island, that gives you a good base to get to the other islands to go see. And Star today is owned by the Star Island Corporation, which is a religious and educational nonprofit that was founded in 1916 when the Leighton brothers finally sort of gave up and the bank was going to take the islands back. And a bunch of those Unitarians who'd been going to the conferences didn't want to see the place they had come to love go away. There were rumors that a casino was going to be built out there at the time. And so the Unitarians got together, raised the money, and purchased the Leighton brothers' investments to guarantee they could still have conferences. And then they expanded it from there. The Congregationalists began coming as well. But these days, although there is a strong religious tradition, you do not have to be religious to go out there. They have conferences all summer long on everything from international affairs to family retreats to digital photography to yoga and meditation and choirs and square dancing. If you name it, there's probably a class happening at a conference out at Star. They also, within the last decade, started opening up like a normal hotel, so you could book a room just for a night or two without being part of a conference and committing to the week. Which again is a nice way to get out and explore the islands if you've never been out there, but you're hesitant to commit to a week sight unseen. And yeah, private vessels are welcome. Also, you can come and hit the snack bar and the bookstore and such by taking a mooring out in the harbor. The main focus for me, my pride and joy has always been Vaughan Cottage, which is the building here on the left. This is the Island Museum, and it's had some updates in recent years. But during the years I was curator, it was a tiny little building with 2 rooms on the floor, on the ground floor, and an attic space up above that with a small fireproof vault built into the middle of the building. And it was named for a gentleman who loved the sea and loved boats, but had never been to the Isles of Shoals. But his wife wanted to donate his library to somewhere that would appreciate it, that would honor his love of the ocean. And so Vaughan Cottage was the result of that. And there are 2 really, really useful resources out there. One is Lyman Rutledge's 7-volume edition of the Isles of Shoals in Lore and Legend. Isles of Shoals in Lore and Legend is a very great book. It's a great book. It's a fairly easy read. It's nicely written. And this is all this, and the 7-volume version is a hand-typed bound series of books with all the stuff he couldn't fit in there. He was my kind of historian, that he wrote down every piece of trivia possibly related to his subject, and then decided he would winnow through it at the end to write his finished book. But he didn't want to get rid of all of his notes. So the 7-volume edition, if you have specific questions, chances are you can find an answer in there, because it's everything from oral history interviews to transcribed primary sources. Really, really handy. I think either the Athenaeum or this library has a copy. There is a copy on the mainland. There's one copy out on Star, and those might be the only 2 copies that exist. It was never commercially printed. It was just privately typed up by his wife. The other really useful one is Louise Tallman, who passed away a few years ago, but does anyone here remember Louise? She lived in Rye, and she did her passion was genealogy. She went through every primary source she could find and consolidated everything into 3-ring binders with family sheets, with the husband's names and the wife's surname and the date of the marriage and all the kids. For as many families as she could find. And her collection of the families of Gosport is at Vaughan Cottage. Again, there's a copy, I think there's a copy in the Rye Library. There's probably a copy at Portsmouth. Yeah, and it wasn't just Gosport. She did one for Portsmouth and she did one for Rye as well. She might have done another town as well, but her work is pretty much the gold standard for seacoast, like 18th and 19th century family tracking. If you've got relatives you're trying to hunt down, I highly recommend finding a copy of her binders and flipping through them, because they will at least give you some footnotes you can track down from there. So a view inside the museum here. This is from one of the years I was curator, just showing you that we have an exhibit room on one side and a library on the other. That year I had an exhibit up on some of the island archaeology, because as I said, you got hundreds of years of history and only a few feet of topsoil. So it's always amazing. Every time it rains, you find everything from a 17th century pipe stem to last week's beer bottle. It's really astounding how much comes up out there. There's a lot of hotel china. But behind here is a collection of Celia Thaxter's painted china. She was not just famous for her poetry, but she started doing china painting work as a socially acceptable way for a woman to make money in the 19th century. It was still considered the feminine arts that she was doing painting and domestic on these domestic items and decorative items that she could then sell and make a little bit of money. Her husband was a very well-educated man, but never found a job he liked well enough to keep very long. And so a lot of the family's financial strain fell on Celia to shoulder the burden of supporting her husband and several children. And selling her art was one of the ways she did that. And Vaughan Cottage has a really lovely collection of the painted china that she's done over the years. It was inspired a lot by her love of nature and a trip to Greece she took. It's a bit jarring to see all the anemones and woodbine and such, but and then you've got the vases covered with olive vines up there as well, which is definitely not native Isles of Shoals plants. But this is a sampling of some of the motifs that she did and some of the scale she worked on. That large woodbine vase is about 12 to 15 inches tall, all the way down to those little tiny collar buttons, which are about the size of your thumbnail. So she really had quite a skill in capturing art on different shapes and sizes of china. This picture is the inside of the Portsmouth Athenaeum, because if you've never been in there, you should definitely check it out. It is the Athenaeum is on Market Street, on Market Square in Portsmouth, and it was founded sort of as a sea captain's society. And it was much along the lines of the old cabinet of curiosities when it started, of sort of all of the odds and ends people were bringing back from overseas, and here's your cabinet of weird things to look at. It then from there expanded into a reading library and has continued to the present day as a really valuable resource for regional history and as well as maritime history. And I love the fact that this is their old reading room. They have a modern reading room upstairs as well. But I love the fact that that old reading room has not really visually changed much since the Civil War. It's an incredibly neat space. And most of Star Island Corporation has a lot of materials on deposit in there. Most of their collections are on deposit at the Athenaeum because Vaughan Cottage is very small. It's only 2 rooms. And there's major issues with, well, it's got a climate control system now, but there used to be major issues with humidity out there. Being in a marine environment, it's hard to keep your stuff stable. So the Athenaeum is the custodian of a lot of the Shoals resources, and they are available for the public to come in and research. All you got to do is set up an appointment. And the other, oops, wrong slide. The other resource that is often overlooked is the Rye Public Library and the Rye Historical Society, because Star Island is technically in the town of Rye. So Rye has a lot of their documents there, and also due to the really high number of intermarrying between Rye families and Gosport families, you can find a lot of the same names referred to in both places. So it's a great, if you've got a dead end for a branch, go check in Rye and see if you can find some more ancestors to keep working back from there. They have some intriguing documents. I remember one of the times I went down there, they showed me the receipt for the local coffin maker in the 1830s or 1840s, and it listed everybody who he had made a coffin for. So you at least had a whole list of death dates there you could go off of from people who may not have whose death certificates may not have survived. So yeah, again, go down to Rye and check them out if you're looking for Shoals genealogy stuff. Their staff there are quite helpful. And the last resource I just want to reference is findagrave.com. I'm sure you probably are familiar with that, but it's an open source database of cemeteries. And I'm actually the one who inventoried most of the Star Island ones. So there are 3 cemeteries on Star, 1 over on Smuttynose, and the Leighton and Thaxter family plot over on Appledore. And so again, if you look those up on findagrave.com, a lot of the people there have already been attached to other family members through the Find a Grave genealogy community. So those gravestones are linked to other people in the family. So you can, again, kind of start working your way through the family trees to see, hopefully to get where you're going in solving any of your dead ends. But yeah, so that is my whirlwind tour through the Isles of Shoals history and the resources that are available so that you can help flesh out the history for yourself and help get over some of those very frustrating dead ends. I too am a big genealogy dork, which I'm sure is unsurprising. And I often describe it as like trying to do a jigsaw puzzle where one of the pieces may be on the floor and you don't know. But at this point, I'm happy to take any questions, comments, concerns, criticisms, friendly compliments.
It was an excellent talk, and you are an excellent presenter. Very engaging and informative. You do genealogical work?
I have, yeah. I mean, I'm always
good to know.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. No, I have a database with about 10,000 people in it that I've put together over the years because when I first started writing my master's thesis on the Shoals community, I knew everybody was related, but I had no idea how. So I had to start with the genealogy spreadsheets just to figure out, like, are these 2 cousins trading stuff, or is this a business deal? So I've got a massive database. I'm always happy to take a look through what I've got to see if I can help anybody. Yeah, sure.
We do maritime. Do you find that the Shoals, you mentioned like,
Yes.
okay. Do you find that the Shoals are related to other fishing areas, like say in Bedford?
The shoal, yeah, I know the shoals are interesting because they are an almost unique style that they don't. Well, all right. In the early phase of the settlement, the shoals were unique among the collection of fishing stations up and down the New England coast. That most of the fishing stations between Cape Cod and the Canadian border in the 1600s were investment properties. Essentially, you'd get a merchant who would finance a trip to go over there, who would then set up the business, and everybody on the island worked for him. Star was a whole collection of independent boat owners working together that got consolidated under larger landowners as the fortunes shifted, but it was never a company town in the way that like Damariscove or Richmond Island off of the coast of Maine were. By the time the big ports of like Gloucester and New Bedford start rising, the Isles of Shoals were already in decline. Their fishery had become very old fashioned by that point. Like by the 1800s, as fresh fish becomes more available, the shoalers really were sort of on the wrong side of the line. They were in a really dead end industry. So you do see some individual shoalers going to work for like vessels out of those ports and going out to say the Grand Banks, but the shoals themselves really did not have the resources to do that. And so therefore they weren't playing in the same league as Gloucester or New Bedford or Portland. Does that kind of answer what
Kind of, I've got, New Bedford fishermen in my trade.
Yeah, probably, I would say they are probably not, you're not going to find a relation to any of the Shoals families. That they did intermarry with mainland families, but only really specifically in the seacoast area. And a little bit later, they start intermarrying with some Nova Scotian people, which again, you have to wonder how that connections happen. You do see a few Nova Scotians marrying in the Isles of Shoals, but yeah, and undoubtedly that there's a fisheries connection in there. I just haven't been able to put my finger on it. Yeah.
Couple questions online.
Sure.
So the first one is from Sue, who said, I tried to reach the current librarian at Vaughan and have never heard back with research questions regarding Randall and Haley, who are my grandparents. How do you reach the librarian out of season?
Okay. Yeah, right now I think they're currently in between curators. The winter season is a hard time to get a hold of folks because Star is open from like May through October on the island. Or well, sorry, the open season for visitors is like June through the end of September, early October. And so in the off season, there isn't necessarily a staff member for every post. But they can contact the office staff at Star Island. I'm also, I can also, my email address I can provide as well.
Great, thank you. They also asked, what about resources up at UNH?
Yeah, UNH does have some, but it is the more specialized genealogy stuff is closer to the coast. It's UNH does have a lot of stuff about like the marine lab on deposit, but yeah, not a whole lot for like the genealogy side of things. It's much more of the sciences side of things at UNH.
Great, thank you. And Sandy has asked, have there ever been artifacts of Reverend Joseph Hull, who was 1596 to 1665, who lived on Appledore and allegedly died on Smuttynose?
Yes. Great question. I don't think there is any surviving trace of him beyond just his name being referenced in the records. I'm trying to remember. There's been some archaeology done on Appledore, but it was before my time, and I'm not really certain where they were digging. But to my knowledge, no, there really is very little surviving of Joe to suggest Joseph Hull's presence.
Great. And then someone who doesn't have a name on here just wants to say that as a child, they sat at the feet of Lyman on the Oceanic porch, and they've never seen a presentation as good or informative as yours.
I know that wasn't my parents, but yeah.
And yeah, there's a couple of comments about how great it was. Thanks. Does anyone have any other questions, either online or here in person?
What do you do now?
A little bit of everything. I spent last winter, I was working for the Penobscot Marine Museum as a contract archivist in their chart collections. But mostly I work on schooners. I work for the schooner American Eagle and the schooner J&E Reagan, both out of Rockland, Maine. I cook on board, but I also lead history trips. depending on what'll get me out there to be able to sail. Have trivia, will travel.
And what did you say, the Penobscot? what?
Penobscot Marine Museum up in Searsport, right up at the head of Penobscot Bay. It's, yeah, it's a surprisingly large, they've got a number of buildings and focus on sort of Maine's maritime heritage. And yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff up there too.
We had a workshop with Sipperly.
Oh, yeah,
Really
yeah,
good.
yeah.
I think it was a year and a half ago, maybe,
Nice.
and I think we might have the recording somewhere on. And buried on the drive, so if anyone wants to do that, just contact us, we can try and get that out.
And actually, the Penobscot Marine Museum has a massive photography collection, which is all digitized online and searchable. So the Penobscot Marine Museum's photography collection has literally thousands and thousands of images covering anything you could imagine. One of their big collections is they ended up getting all of the negatives for the Eastern Illustrating Company that did a bunch of those like local scenes of local life America postcards that get reproduced fairly often, but they have all of those negatives. So like snapshots of random places around New England from the late 18 and early 1900s, as well as, again, just all the various pictures you could imagine a marine museum would have.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to end the Zoom on Zoom. Bye, everyone.